From Islam Makhachev getting handed the win over Alexander Volkanovski to Johnny Hendrix's robbery in his fight against George St. Pierre, these are the UFC's most controversial judging calls. What better way for me to start off than with UFC 284? The fight between Alexander Volkanovski and Islam Makhachev was supposed to decide the pound-for-pound world number one. And Alex the Great got the short end of the stick, even though everyone thinks he won that day. Thing is, Volk still managed to hold on to his number one pound-for-pound ranking ahead of lightweight champ Islam, even though he lost to the Russian through a controversial decision. The judges unanimously handed the win to Makhachev, mainly because he out-wrestled the local favorite. But fans were downright furious with one of the 49-46 scorecards because even the other two 48-47 scorecards were pushing it. Even Volk himself thinks he should have won in the second, third, and fifth rounds. And he had MMA legend Chael Sonnen backing him up. According to Chael, Aussie fans should have thrown garbage into the octagon after the fight. Chael backed the P4P rankings decision, saying it accurately shows what went down in the cage. He even went as far as to say that the rankings committee was the most spineless bunch in the sport. Fans agreed, saying it's moments like these that make them question the whole UFC judging system. Any robbery list is incomplete if I don't mention UFC 282, where Paddy Pimblett managed to snatch a victory over Jared Gordon by a ridiculous judging call. The fight kicked off with Pimblett showing his intent, charging forward with kicks and straight punches, but Gordon wasn't about to let him have it all his way. And in a quick counterattack, Gordon landed a powerful left that caught Paddy's attention. He kept going and unleashed a couple more lefts, connecting hard with Paddy's face. Ouch. Paddy tried pushing forward with combinations, but Gordon never backed down for a single moment during that fight. And as the first round was coming to a close, Pimblett tried playing with fire by going for a takedown, but Gordon had other plans. He reversed the move and bam, Pimblett found himself on his back staring up at the lights. When round two began, Jared wasted no time. He scored a quick takedown and even backed Paddy against the fence, pinned him down and landed another takedown. Gordon had the upper hand throughout, and with the final round approaching, both fighters knew it was crunch time. To anyone who watched the fight, there's no doubt that Paddy was being outstruck and outgrappled throughout the entire thing, but he somehow managed to walk away with a unanimous decision win. Can you believe it? Neither could the fighters or the fans. It was a robbery in plain sight, a decision that defied all logic. Just like the one at UFC 280 when Sean O'Malley took on Peter Yan in a split decision that left everyone scratching their heads. The fight started off with a bang when O'Malley poked Yan in the eye, but Yan didn't let that slow him down. He fired back with a brutal body kick, and those leg kicks of his were punishing O'Malley's leading leg. It was like he was chopping down a tree. Yan managed to take O'Malley down, and even though O'Malley caught him off guard in the second round with a wicked combination, Peter wasn't going down. He took his revenge with a devastating punch of his own that dropped Sugar Sean to the mat. Peter ended up on top of Sean, and going into the third round, both fighters were landing some serious blows with Peter taking O'Malley down and controlling him. So after all that intense action, you'd think the judges would hand the win to Peter, right? Wrong. They declared O'Malley the winner, and even the commentators were shocked. Fighters, fans, and yes, even O'Malley himself were confused, wondering what in the world just happened. Yan won every single round on the verdict scorecard, and everyone seemed to agree, including UFC Hall of Famer Khabib Nurmagomedov. He said he couldn't understand how O'Malley managed to snatch the victory when he thought Yan clearly dominated all three rounds. It was the same thing at UFC Fight Night 42, where the fighters in the spotlight were Diego Sanchez and Ross Pearson. Fans were angry that night, wondering how in the world 2 out of 3 judges gave Sanchez the win, after Ross dominated him for a solid 15 minutes. The fan reactions were strong, saying that you gotta wonder if those judges had their eyes checked, or if they were just plain incompetent. They said, that decision might go down in history as the worst robbery ever seen in the world of MMA. And trust me, that's saying something. If we're being super generous here, we could maybe give Sanchez 1 round out of the 3. But even that's a big stretch, because honestly, when you look at both the action in the cage and the stats on paper, it's crystal clear that Pearson won every single round. I'm talking about landing more strikes, scoring the only knockdown of the fight, and even getting credit for the sole takedown. Effective aggression? Pearson owned that. Octagon control? If it involves bleeding all over the canvas, Pearson won that too. The only things he didn't dominate were making scary facial expressions and having the crowd support. Now, if we're searching for any sort of logic behind the judge's decision, fans said they have to consider one thing, which is hometown advantage. Yep, Sanchez is one of Albuquerque's own. That might be the only reason he was even in the co-main event. After losing 3 out of his last 4 fights, it was like they were trying to give him a pity win, just like they did with Carlos Condit when he faced off Nick Diaz at UFC 143. The crowd that day was absolutely certain that Diaz had sealed the deal and came out on top, but the scorecards had a different story to tell, giving the win to Carlos. The fight started off with a bang, and Diaz, being the main aggressor, kept moving forward throughout the match. On the other side of the cage, Carlos had a different game plan in mind. He was all about that circle game, moving around like a ninja. His leg kicks were also on point, scoring him some points from a distance. But Diaz was throwing bombs and actually landing punches in the first round. As the fight went on, Diaz's headhunting strategy started paying off in short bursts. He found his groove and began stalking Carlos, hitting him with 1 or 2 punches at a time. It was like watching a dance with Diaz leading the steps and Carlos trying to keep up. Fast forward to round 5 when Diaz pulled off a late takedown. And let me tell you, it was a thing of beauty. This move allowed Diaz to flaunt his jaw-dropping jiu-jitsu skills and put Carlos in trouble. But when the winner was announced, much to everyone's surprise, it wasn't Nick, even though he had a huge advantage in head strikes that day. He landed 57 of them, compared to Carlos's 52, edging out that category in the first 3 rounds. And if that wasn't enough, Diaz also landed more body strikes, 42 to Carlos's 31. Can you believe the numbers? And finally, saving the best for last, we have the clash that went down at UFC 167 between the 2 titans, GSP and Johnny Hendricks. Now, if there was anyone who could have taken down St. Pierre in his prime, it was Hendricks. This guy was a 2-time NCAA wrestling champ with knockout power that could turn his opponents into mincemeat. Just ask John Fitch, who lasted 5 rounds with St. Pierre, while Hendricks knocked him out in a crazy 12 seconds. St. Pierre came into this fight with a record of 24 wins and only 2 losses, and had recently defeated big names like Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit, and Jake Shields. But when it started off, Johnny hit GSP harder than anyone had before, while he was a bit behind, and his tactical striking wasn't the usual surgical dissection we were used to seeing from him. When the final bell rang, there was something in the air, a feeling that maybe we were about to watch a changing of the guard. But hold on, 2 out of 3 judges disagreed and gave the victory to St. Pierre. Yep, he retained his title through a split decision. That's still marked as one of the most controversial ones to this day. The real kicker was when he then decided to step away from the fight game, meaning no rematch and no chance for Hendricks to get his shot at redemption. After the fight, even Dana White himself was scratching his head, totally confused by the judge's call. He straight up asked the media if any of them thought that Johnny didn't win the fight. Even Johnny himself knows he won 4 out of the 5 rounds, and many fans backed him up, saying that this fight right here exposed the problems with a 10-point system or anything lower for MMA. And they had a point, since Hendricks undeniably dominated his rounds, delivering powerful strikes and controlling the pace. Meanwhile, GSP barely managed to squeak out his own rounds, and in the end, both fighters' rounds were worth the same points. So from Johnny Hendricks' robbery in his fight against George St. Pierre, to Islam Makhachev getting handed the win over Alex Volkanovski, those were the UFC's most controversial judging calls.